This is talkSPORT MMA, and I'm delighted to bring you a very special guest today. It's none other than Mr. Colby Covington, fresh off his RAF win over Luke Rockhold. Colby, that must have felt quite good.
It felt really good, brother. What RFA is doing in the sport of wrestling and combat sports in general is really transcending the sport. You know, they're taking a new sport to new heights with the production, with just the overall theme of everything. So it was a great win, you know, against a former UFC champ. You know, Luke Rockhold's a legend. You know, he's the first ballot Hall of Famer, and he'll go down, you know, in the Hall of Fame for the UFC. So it was a big win, and I'm looking forward to what's next in the RAF.
Colby, where am I speaking to you from today? What are you up to?
So I'm in Las Vegas. I just was here for the fights last weekend, was talking to the UFC a little bit. And so I'm still in Las Vegas. I'm about to head back to Miami, Florida today. Got to go see all the mamacitas in South Beach.
That's awesome. I do want to dive into that, but I want to keep talking, you know, about RAF right now. It seems like, you know, over the last 5 months, they've really exploded, and it seems to be something really exciting. You know, the next card, we've got Cejudo and Uriah Faber at RAF 6, and we had yourself, Luke Rockhold. You know, just speaking on the next card, the likes of Makhachev, people like Arman Sarukian have been involved. How exciting is it to see, you know, a wrestling promotion like this, you know, shoot into the sky like it has?
Yeah, it's been incredible, you know, what they've done with RAF, you know. Chad Bronstein, Eric Bischoff, and Izzy Martinez have really changed the sport of wrestling. You know, they're making wrestling fun again. They're making it exciting. They're putting a new twist on it. You know, from the late great Hulk Hogan. You know, he wanted this vision for wrestling to, you know, play to the masses and for people to enjoy what they're seeing. So, you know, it's exciting, man. It's really exciting because this is, you know, something that's from the ground up. You know, it's just being started. That was I competed in RAF 5. That was the 5th event. So, you know, it's the early stages. I think this thing's going to go to something big. I really do think it'll compete with mainstream sports these days. You see the big matchups, you know, they're putting together. Like you just said, you know, all those big names in the UFC. So this is what the fans want to see. They want to see the biggest and best fights and biggest and best matches. And that's what RAF's doing. So I'm excited to be a part of it.
No, yeah, with RAF, as you just said, the challenge will be going into the mainstream media. You know, it helps having all these legends of the sport involved already. And how do you think, you know, our RAF will manage to kind of convert, you know, get the core MMA fan base over to the wrestling side of things? Because you know what it's like, you know, from maybe a casual MMA fan might view wrestling as, you know, the boring side of the sport. You know, maybe they prefer the striking aspect to it. So how do you think they can kind of counter that challenge of bringing people in and keeping it fresh and exciting?
You know, everybody loves wrestling. You know, it's the biggest and best component of UFC and martial arts. So wrestling is one of the oldest sports in history. You know, the Roman gladiators were doing it. You know, people used to come to coliseums to watch people wrestle. So, you know, wrestling is the ultimate test of a man, to see who's the real alpha in the room, you know. So we're finding out who's the real alpha. RAF is, you know, deciding who's the real alphas, and you know, it's just amazing, you know, what they're doing. You know, they're on Fox News Nation, so they're getting so many eyes from, you know, the general public and people that have no idea even what martial arts and wrestling is. But, you know, it's being put in front of their face, and people are liking it. You've seen they're very receptive. You know, my match was almost a sellout, you know, in my backyard in Amerant Bank Arena. So, you know, people are excited about this. RAF's making it fun. You know, I mean, the walkouts, I don't know if you get to see my walk. I got to walk out with this famous country singer, Brantley Gilbert, and he played this song, Real American, you know, by Hulk Hogan's old walkout song, but he put it in his version. So, you know, they're just doing things differently, you know, that no other wrestling league ever did. So I know that Chad, Izzy, and Eric Bischoff, they're super invested in this league. They want to bring it to the top. So they're going to do everything they can. They're going to, you know, get the right finances. They're going to, you know, put the right production behind it. And, you know, people like seeing it. So, you know, I think the best is yet to come for RAF.
And Kobe, you talked a bit about, you know, your fact when you fought Luke Rockhold, it was a bit of a test to see how you would get on against someone bigger than yourself, you know, almost teasing a move up to middleweight in the UFC. But I wanted to ask you, is kind of being involved with RAF, I know you've also mentioned the WWE in the past, and we know you're a natural on the mic. We know that you can connect with the fans like no other in the sport, and we've seen you do that already at RAF. Is this almost setting up what it would be like to get involved in the professional wrestling scene as well?
Yeah, I think so. You see a lot of the people that are behind RAF. They're, a lot of guys that, worked within the WWE. So, I think this is my perfect opportunity to see if I can transition, if I can make that transition. Can I get the fans excited? Can I hit the right promos? Can I electrify the crowds? So yeah, I think this is, a great opportunity in RAF for me to build up my persona a little more, get some big wins under my belt, like I just got, a couple weekends ago against former UFC champ, doing my first love. Wrestling was my first and true love. So I'm so thankful that RAF gave me this opportunity to do what I'm so passionate about. Wrestling is my life, and it's a lifestyle, right? You don't just part-time wrestle. Wrestling is a 24/7, 365 commitment. So, super thankful to be in RAF, and, super thankful to kind of hone in and develop my skills that could maybe transition to WWE one day.
And just sticking to that point once more, you've mentioned a name like Logan Paul being able to go into the WWE and hit the ground running. We've seen what he's done in 2025 and what he plans to do. Now he's signed a full-term contract with the WWE. Does seeing someone like Logan go in and do what he's done, because we've seen in the past, fighters, outside of the WWE go in and maybe not be as successful as others. Does that give you confidence that you can go in and be a real superstar in the WWE, not only make, a one-off appearance, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, it really does. You look at a guy like Logan, he was a YouTube guy, he never had any extensive wrestling background like myself. I've wrestled my whole life, and I've been a part of a couple of angles, in a couple different wrestling leagues. So, I know what it takes to be great in that sport. And, I love the sport. I love everything about it. So, I was at WrestleMania last year. It was an incredible time, 100,000 people out there. So, that's what I see for myself, competing in front of 100 million people, or 100,000 people in one arena would just be a dream come true for me. I feel like that's something I've been working for my whole life. So I'm thankful that RAF is giving me this opportunity, because without this opportunity with RAF, none of this would be possible. So, no one knows what's going to happen with me in Chaos. He's unpredictable. So you never know where I'll show up next.
Now, you said you're in Vegas, and I do want to touch on UFC 324 in a bit, but you mentioned a couple of conversations with the UFC. I think it's clear now you've put out there that the next move when you do return to the UFC, you haven't fought since the Buckley fight in December of 2024. The next move is a move up in weight division, up to middleweight. Is that 100%?
It's not 100%, but, I just want to throw more opportunities and ideas out there for the UFC. The first thing I told RAF is, I didn't want to cut a lot of weight. I wanted to just show up and compete at my natural weight and show who the biggest and baddest fighter on the planet is. And so that's what I did. I went up to, a bigger weight class against a way bigger guy, who had 3 inches in height and 20, 30 pounds on me. And, I controlled him and handled him very easily. I was throwing him around like a sack of potatoes. So I felt good. I feel good at a higher weight class. I feel like that's what plagued me a lot in my last fight is, they gave me a short notice fight, only 2 weeks to prepare for that fight. And they wanted me to cut all this weight. So I cut all this weight, 30 pounds, and I was just depleted. I had no energy to fight, and so, I think if I go up to middleweight, I'm going to have a lot more energy. And honestly, at middleweight, there's just a lot bigger fights. There's a lot of former champions, a lot of bigger names. Welterweights, it's a little stale. None of these guys, could draw money with a green crayon and a white piece of paper. So, the money that's being drawn could be at middleweight. And, I just want to throw more ideas out there for the UFC and RAF.
Now, Dana White made it clear that after UFC 324, he was going to start putting together some of the fights for this White House card in June. I still can't believe, the White House card is going to happen. I thought when Trump first talked about it, it was just a bit of an idea. Now, this is something that's seriously going to happen. So what were those conversations like? Was this talk about the White House card?
I can't kiss and tell, because I don't want to get in trouble contractually, but, there was definitely some talks about, potentially being on the White House card. No, no, but everybody knows, I'm the number one person that should be on it. I'm the one that, started supporting Trump when no one supported him, when everybody used to hate him. It wasn't the cool thing to do. When I was out there walking through Times Square, Madison Square Garden in downtown New York City, I was wearing a MAGA hat. And this is in a place that was the most liberal place that hated Donald Trump more than anything. So I was getting yelled at, spit on, a lot of name calling and a lot of death threats. So, I feel like I deserve to be on the White House card. That I just feel like it will be so special, to be at the White House. It's going to be the biggest spectacle in all of sports history, and to represent our country on the big stage in front of our president. I just feel like that's going to bring out the best in me. So I'm hoping, I'm praying. I want to be on that White House card, but at the end of the day, it's ultimately up to the UFC. So we'll see what they have in plan.
If the UFC came to you and offered you a fight before the White House card, what would your response be to that?
It would be tough. I've never turned down a fight. I'm an ultimate company man. I always step up to fight. So if the company needs me, of course I'm going to show up for the company. I love this company. This company's given me everything. It gave me the lifestyle to be my own boss now and the CEO of my company, Chaos Covington Incorporated. So, yeah, it would be tough, man. I'm a yes man, man. I show up, I show out, and I do good business. So, I want to do good business for the companies UFC and RAF, but ultimately that's my dream now. Now that I know that there's going to be a fight at the White House, that's the dream. I feel like a little kid in a candy shack. Give me that opportunity. I promise I'll pass with aces.
So, but the ideal situation is, the next fight takes place on the South Lawn of the White House.
Yeah, definitely. That's the ideal situation. That's, something that I feel like has been a long time coming. I've really been able to mix politics and sport and bring, a wider audience to the sport that wouldn't have watched MMA, but they watch me because they love that I support Donald Trump. They love that I'm a fearless patriot and I don't care what people think of me. So yeah, that would be ideal. That would be just the perfect cap and feather in my career to go compete at the White House and get my hand raised on the South Lawn.
And you've mentioned Israel Adesanya, Sean Strickland in terms of the move up to middleweight. At welterweight, a few names come to mind. Wonder Boy, Gilbert Burns that would make for a good fight on the White House. Have you thought about a specific opponent, or is it just a matter of fact of wanting to just get the spot in the first place?
Yeah, I think most importantly is just to get the spot, against anybody. I'll take anybody on the White House card. No one's going to beat me in front of my president. No one's going to beat me in front of all my patriotic friends, that are up in DC. So, of course, that's the plan. All those names sound like great ideas. Wonder Boy, he's been up there in the division with me a long time. Gilbert Burns, the same as well. We've never been able to cross paths and fight. Sean Strickland, Israel Adesanya, former champions in middleweight. I think they're great matchups for me. I think they're a lot slower than the welterweights. They hit harder, but they're slower, and I think they're predictable. So I like those fights a lot. One more idea that could be presented, is Paddy Pimblett, man. He's a big guy. He cuts a lot of weight. He may not want to keep going to 155. So what's the sense of Paddy going back to 155? There's no big fights for him now that he lost to Gaethje. So, he's a big guy. He's probably weighs more than me at walk around weight anyways. So, I want to present that idea to the UFC that, hey, me and Paddy, a British guy and a USA guy on the white lawn, would be amazing. I think that would be awesome. I don't want to fight an American because, it doesn't make sense to fight an American in the American capital on the 250th birthday of America. So, I think Paddy Pimblett makes sense. He's got a bowl cut. He's got an accent. So I think the fight will get the fans excited. And, there's definitely some turmoil between us. He doesn't like me. I don't like him. So let's get locked in the cage and handle our differences.
Yeah, you did. You had a bit of a run-in with Paddy after his last win against Michael Chandler. You've mentioned Paddy, so let's talk about the main event of UFC 324. Can you give me your thoughts on the main event? Your thoughts on Paddy's performance and how Justin Gaethje performed on the night?
Yeah, I thought that Justin Gaethje looked really bad, but Paddy looked even worse. So, Justin looked just like a really old, slow, punch drunk dude. I call him the king of CTE because he's been hitting the head a lot. So he's got that CTE and he just looked bad. But, Paddy looked worse. He didn't look very good. He looked sluggish. He didn't look fast, hands down a lot. Just very amateur rookie mistakes that he made. But, he's never been in a main event spotlight. So this is his first time getting the main event spotlight and all that requires of a main event fight. It's a lot, man. The media week, the cutting the weight, the media just work you have to do in the lead up to the fight is just, you have to handle a big load. So I think he realized that, it's a lot tougher up there than he thought it was. He was talking a big game, saying he was going to be champion, saying he was going to be this and that, but he'd never been in that spotlight, and he got that spotlight and he didn't pass the test. He froze under the pressure. So, I didn't see anything special. It was a good fight for sure. People like seeing it, but what I saw in the fight, Justin just looked shot. He doesn't look like he has that dog left in him. I don't know. He's just, the CTE really got to him.
There was a bit of discussion about Paddy's game plan, and we could visibly hear his coaches screaming at him to go for the takedown. Do you know why that might have been? It seems to be as if he would have been in a far better position should he have took Gaethje to the ground.
I just don't see Paddy taking Gaethje to the ground. Gaethje's an all-American wrestler. He doesn't wrestle in any of his fights. He likes to stand and bang and, fight in a phone booth. That's his style, is just to brawl with guys. But, he's got some good wrestling. He wrestled his whole life. I used to wrestle him all the time. I grew up in Oregon and he was in Colorado, and, we would cross paths. Or he was in Arizona. We would cross paths a lot at a lot of local tournaments. So, he's got good wrestling, and I think Paddy saw that. He probably tried to shoot. I think he tried to shoot a shot, and he realized that Gaethje sprawled pretty easily and, kept him in the front headlock and was dirtying him up with some dirty boxing down there on the mat. So I think that he just was like, no, I'm not going to be able to take him down. So he's not going to try and waste energy. He tried to conserve energy and tried to look for his shots with a lot of kicks and a lot of rangy stuff because he's got the reach. Paddy had the reach on Gaethje. So, yeah, no, I'm not surprised that he didn't try to take him down. Gaethje's got better wrestling credentials.
Based on what you've just said, I assume that you think Gaethje Tapuria, it's an easy win for Ilia Topuria in the undisputed fight.
Yeah, that I see Ilia knocking him out within a minute. I don't think he'll last longer than a minute. The way he ducks his head, Ilia's going to land an uppercut on him, and he's going to send him to moon.
You mentioned Paddy there as a potential. I mean, I would love to see, being, over here, and I would love to see Paddy in any fight at the White House, but I'm very fascinated to hear your thoughts on Mr. Conor McGregor and his return to the White House. Dana White's come out and said that it won't be Michael Chandler. There doesn't seem to be any, there's been names, Nate Diaz, Jorge Masvidal has been mentioned. I think you would also be in that category. You've been out of the UFC for a couple of years. Give me your thoughts on a potential fight with Conor McGregor.
Yeah, that would be a great fight. It'd be an exciting fight for the fans. I think the press conference would be worth the price of admission alone because, there's no one better on a mic than Conor and I. So, I would love the opportunity to share the stage with Conor. I respect a lot of what he's been able to accomplish in his career. He's really transcended the sport as well. He's brought, people to the sport that never followed the sport before, but they followed it because they want to hear Conor McGregor's trash talk. So, yeah, I would love that fight. I think it would be a super exciting fight, a big fight that really gets the fans captivated and excited. So, but, I don't know. Conor kind of calls his shots. He gets to kind of pick who he wants. And I don't know if he wants to fight a guy like me. I'm a tough matchup. I'm probably the toughest, most well-rounded fighter in the UFC. So, I think he may be looking for a striker or maybe an older guy. I don't think he's going to look for someone like me, but, would love the opportunity if it ever presented himself. But I also have a lot of respect for Conor, and he's doing amazing things. And we'll see if he actually comes back or not.
Well, I was just about to say, we'll see if he actually comes back. Now, that's a great point. How realistic do you actually think that we will see McGregor back at the White House?
From my point of view, it's like, I don't know. I don't see it. What's the point of Conor fighting anymore? He's made so much money with the whiskey deal, with all his fights. He's worth hundreds of millions. So what's the motivation to get up in the morning and train? What's the motivation, to get locked in that cage and have that hungry dog in you to kill another man? So, I don't know. I don't know how realistic it is.
I think the motivation would be the same as yourself, wanting to be the star of the White House card and being able to fight, in front of the president and on the South Lawn.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That there'll never be anything like that in history. It's the fact that President Trump is going to make it happen is just so truly special, and I'm just so thankful to him for doing that. But yeah, for sure, you're right. And maybe he wants to. I know he's changed his ways. Conor went and got baptized, and he got married, and he's given his life to Christ, and he's changing ways. So maybe this is his way to change his life and get back on track. He was partying pretty heavy for many years, and that's who he was. But now he's a devoted Christian, a devoted family man, and looks like he wants to get devoted back to the MMA game, back on the South Lawn. So Conor, let's go, bro. Let's make this happen. Let's give the fans a show, and let's put on the biggest and highest level fight that we could possibly do at the White House.
Just a couple of more, Colby, and then I'll let you go. The UFC rankings update was released today, after UFC 324. Couple of changes. Paddy holds on to his number 5 spot in the lightweight division, and I know there was a couple of comments Dana White made about yourself being ranked 14th at welterweight in the UFC, and I know you've responded, saying it doesn't really matter what Dana White thinks. You're the star of the show. So I kind of want to ask you, like, what is the motivation now? Is the motivation just big fights now for yourself at the end of the career, or is there a sense of you that wants to taste, UFC gold one last time, even at the age of 37?
Yeah, I think the motivation is just big fights, doing good business for the company, the company that changed my life, so I think the most important thing is just to get the big names and the big fights. It's not about trying to get back to the top. I've already been the champion. I've already been America's champion, the people's champ, the king of Miami, Donald Trump's favorite fighter. So I have all the most prestigious championships you can ever have. So that's why it doesn't matter. And it didn't matter that Dana White said, oh, take him out of the rankings. What does it matter? The reason most people get ranked in the first place is because the fans need something to identify with. Oh, here's this Joe Schmo Blow. He's number 10 in the world, so they can advertise and they can sell it. You don't need to do that with me. My name speaks for itself. I walk around Vegas. I can't walk 2 steps without getting bothered by fans. There's not that type of appeal with a lot of fighters in the UFC, unless you're like a Conor McGregor, But so, yeah, the rankings doesn't matter. It's about big fights to me now. Legendary fights, fights that solidify my legacy and my Hall of Fame status in the UFC.
One fight that has been heavily tipped for the White House card is that Makhachev's first defense of the welterweight title, and there's been a name thrown in there who you have history with, Kamaru Usman. What are your thoughts on that potential matchup and being on the White House card as well?
Yeah, I had heard. I don't know if they're going to let Russian fighters on that card. I don't know if they're going to let the fighter. The last I had heard, they weren't letting any Russian fighters on there. It didn't really make sense. So I don't think Makhachev will be able to compete at the White House, and nor do I think he wants to compete there. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't see that fight happening at the White House. But
so let's say it's not at the White House. What about just Makhachev, Usman?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Does Usman deserve it? Maybe because he's long standing in the division. Who else is there? They could, yeah. I don't know. It just depends on what the UFC is going to do. If they want to go with the new blood, they got the Michael Morales kid. He's right there. He could probably compete for the title. We'll see. I want to see Topuria Makhachev. That's the fight I really want to see. I feel like that's a high level fight. That really determines who the pound for pound best fighter in the UFC is. So, if there's any fight they can make happen with Makhachev, I want to see it with Topuria.
And Colby, just to finish off, you talked about your wrestling roots, and that's where this career all began for yourself. And you worked your way through the UFC. You had huge championship fights, become one of the most recognized names in the sport, and now you're one of the favorites to be fighting in the South Lawn of the White House. Do you ever sit back and reflect on this journey and think, like, wow, the position I'm in, and it's all a bit crazy, everything going on right now? You're kind of the real American of the UFC, and to be able to get that fight at the White House would almost culminate what has been quite a phenomenal career for yourself in terms of making it in combat sports. Do you ever sit back and allow yourself to reflect on that?
Yeah, I do. There's some certain days when I go do things and I go travel and I go somewhere and I'm just like, I can't believe I'm so blessed to be living this life. From where I came from a small town in Oregon, from kind of a broken family. And, my parents didn't have enough money to get running hot water all the time. So, there was tough times that we had to endure. But, wrestling, has made this opportunity possible for me to be here today. The hard work that it taught me, the the training schedule, the motivation, the mental toughness that it instills in you. So, I do sometimes reflect, and I thank God. I'm very thankful to God that, he gave me this life. Everything's according to God's plan, and he kind of decides everything. So I'm so gracious and thankful to him that he allowed me to be where I'm at. But also don't want to get caught up in reflecting too much, because when you start reflecting, then it's like, you're 2 feet out, or you're 1 foot out and almost 2 feet out. So I don't want it to be 2 feet out. I'm still fully committed to being the best fighter in the world and to being the best wrestler in RAF. That's what I want to do, is represent RAF. I want to take this sport to a global phenomenon. I want to change everything, and I want to be the leader and the guy that really makes this league go into the mainstream. So, the best is still yet to come for me. I still train harder than I did, in my 20s, and I still want to be the best in the world. So, I want the biggest and best fights. I know that the RAF can give me that, and I'm just super excited to, be living the American dream. And like you said, be a real American. Shout out to Real American Beer.
Colby, thank you so much for your time today. Let's say you get the UFC White House fight, and the UFC, Dana White comes up to you, a blank piece of paper. He says, Colby, I want you to write down the name who you want to fight, and we'll see if we can make it happen. Who would that name be?
Paddy Pimblett, for sure. He ran into me in Miami, and I wasn't saying anything to me. He started chirping at me, saying I'm a bitch. So let's see if you can back that up, Paddy. You talked a lot of bad things about me. I want a respectable fight. I love the UK fans. I'm thankful to be here on talkSPORT today. What a privilege. I've followed, your guys' platform for a long time. You guys are doing amazing things over in the UK. I love all the UK fans. They're the most passionate fans I've ever seen. When I went to the event at the O2 Arena, it was the loudest I'd ever heard of a crowd in the world. So I have a lot of love for the UK fans, and I want to put on a show for the UK fans. And I know that it'll be hard for them to root for me, fighting one of their countrymen, but that's okay. I just want to feel their energy and be able to electrify one of those arenas.
Colby, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to some news with yourself on the White House card.
Thank you so much, brother. Thanks for the time today, and have a great day, and all the best in the future.